Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Kof Ayin Dalid. We saw yesterday that there are two types of guarantors. There's the regular one called an arev, where the lender first has to go to the borrower to collect his money. He has to do his best to get that directly from the borrower. Only if the borrower is dead, missing, has no property, then the lender can go to the guarantor. The guarantor will pay, and then it's up to the guarantor to try to recollect his money from the borrower. That's the arev. However, there's also a kablan. A kablan is an unconditional guarantor. In that case, the lender is allowed to go to that guarantor first, and that guarantor will have to pay no matter what, even if the borrower is around. And according to most opinions, even if he has property, the kablan, he takes it upon himself to say, I am going to pay you, and therefore the borrower can go to him first. Amar Rav Huna, halvehu v'ani arev, halvehu v'ani poreya, halvehu v'ani chayav, halvehu v'ani noten, kulan lashon arvuten. Now we're going to deal with various formulations with whatever the guarantor says. Does that make him an arev or a kablan? So it depends on the precise language that he uses. And there's going to be a few different opinions. Rav Huna says there's some language this way and some that way. He kind of splits it down the middle. He's a middle opinion. So if the guarantor says, lend him money and I will be the arev. Now that is the classic case of a regular arev, because halvehu means it's a loan, and whenever you say halvehu as a loan, that means the borrower has the primary responsibility. And furthermore, he says, I'm an arev, which is the regular arev, so for sure that's arevut. Now the next cases are not as clear, and we're going to see there's going to be machloket about them soon. So if he says, lend him money and I will pay, so that sounds like he's paying, the word poreya. Lend him money and I am responsible. Lend him money and I will give you back that money. Even though that language, chayav, noten, might sound a little bit more like kablanut, nevertheless, since he said halvehu as a loan, so all these are still regular arevut. However, if he says ten lo v'ani kablan, ten lo v'ani poreya, ten lo v'ani chayav, ten lo v'ani noten, kolan neshon kablanut hen. If the guarantor says, give him money, so he's not saying what the lender is giving the borrower. He's not even calling it a loan. He's calling it a gift. So he's saying, gift him money, and I am a kablan. Well, this would be the number one classic case of what a kablan is. You give him money, and I will be a kablan, and I will guarantee to you the money that I will pay you, that for sure. But also if he says, give him and I'm poreya, give him money and I am responsible, give him and I will give you. So you see the second half of these three cases, the same as in over the second half of these first set. But all these are lashon kablanut because he said give him. So that's the main thing between halvehu and ten lo. That's Rav Huna's stance. A question to him, Ibaya lehu, halvehu vani kablan, ten lo vani arev mai. What if you now mix and match and you take the word halvehu, which suggests that it's arevut, but then you say, and I will be a kablan. Well, what about that? Or if you say ten lo, give him money, which sounds like it's kablanut, but then you use the word arev. So now you're taking the classic formulas, but you're mixing and matching the first half and the second half. What do we do in those cases? Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, lashon arvut, arvut, lashon kablanut, kablanut. Rabbi Yitzchak says that you follow what he says I am. If he says I am an arev, then he's an arev, even though he said ten lo. And if he says I am a kablan, then he's a kablan, even though he said it as a loan. Right? That's the primary statement. Whatever he says, this is what I am. Rav Chisda amar kulan lashon kablanuten bar mehalvehu v'ani arev. Rav Chisda says actually all of these formulations that we discussed will be a kablan, except for halvehu v'ani arev, lend him money and I'll be a guarantor. There, when both the first and second half, halvehu, that's a regular loan, arev, I'm just a guarantor. There he's just a guarantor. But any of the other statements, poreya, chayav, give him money, all those will be a kablan. Rava amar kulan lashon arvuten bar meten lo v'ani noten. Rava is the complete opposite, the other extreme of Rav Chisda, and he thinks all of these formulations, the person will be a regular regular guarantor, except for when he says, give him and I will give you. Only in that case, that is a kablan. Give him money, like give him a gift, and then I will give you a gift. Then that's kablanut, but everything else is arevut. Amar le'emor bar amemar Rav Asher hachi amar abba. Ten lo v'ani noten, en amalveh al hadloveh kelum. Amor bar amemar tells Rav Asher, and he quoting his father. His father said something about the same language that Rava just talked about. Ten lo v'ani noten. You give him money, and I will give you money. In that case, the lender cannot go to the borrower at all. Not only can the lender, if he wants, go primarily and go first to the guarantor, he can only go to the guarantor and not to the lender. Why? Because he didn't even say the language of kablan. This is even more extreme. Basically, he's saying to the lender, you give the borrower a gift. It's not even a borrower, right? Give him a gift. And that's a gift is one way. You can't take back a gift. And also, I will give you a gift. And so, in that case, the lender can only go to the guarantor and say, oh, you said you're going to give me a gift. Okay, I'm ready to receive my gift. And so that's how extreme that language would be. However, the Gemara rejects this quote. It's not true. The only case where the borrower doesn't have to answer to the lender at all, meaning the lender cannot even go to the borrower, but can only go to the guarantor. The only case that would happen is if the guarantor himself took money physically from the lender and then he physically gave it to the borrower. Then he's really an intermediary since he's taking it from the lender and he's giving it to the borrower. So you see that the lender and the borrower have nothing in common. They never interacted with each other. The lender never gave money to the borrower. Therefore, the lender cannot go back and receive money or ask for money from the borrower. So in this case, the guarantor really was the middleman. And so in that case, when the lender wants to get paid, of course, he goes to the person who he gave the money to, which is the guarantor. And then the guarantor will be responsible to pay him back. And then the guarantor with the borrower, that depends on whatever deal that they made, and so he disagrees. Even if he says, according to the last statement of the Gemara, even if the guarantor says 10 lo v'ani noten, still the lender can go to the borrower and try to collect the money if he wants to. But he can go to the guarantor first, but he can go there. But according to the last line, no, the lender cannot even go to the borrower at all. They have nothing to do with each other. Now a story. There was a certain judge, we don't know this judge's name, which is a good thing because he did something wrong, and he allowed the lender to go and seize the property of the borrower before the lender even made a claim against the borrower. He told the lender, okay, you know what, just go to that property and you can start farming it, you can start living there, just take it for yourself. But shouldn't the lender have to go to the borrower first and say, hey, can you pay me back? It's time to pay back. Maybe the borrower wants to give cash, or maybe he was going to get some money or some property and give it over. Yeah, you can't just seize it. And so therefore, Salkeh Rav Chanin, when Rav Chanin, the son of Rav Yeva, heard about this, he told the lender, get out, right? You did not do the right thing. He overruled the lower judge who said you can go seize the property, and he said, no, you get out of that property. Amar Rava, man chakim le'ma'abad ki ha'meleta. Ilav Rav Chanin bered Rav Yiba. Rava says, who is so wise to act in this way, if not Rav Chanin, the son of Rav Yiva? Now he's saying, Chazak u'baruch, this was a good ruling that you made. Why? What's the reason that's a good ruling? Kasabar nichse debar inish inun me'arvin yate utnan. Hamavet chabero al yedei arev lo yipara min ha'arev. Kaimalan lo yitba arev techila. Right? Why was Rav Chanin correct? Because he thinks that someone's property is the same as their guarantor. One is just property and one's a live person, but they they function in the same way. As we learned in our Mishnah, if someone lends money to someone else and there's a guarantor, the lender cannot go first to the guarantor to get paid. Rather, he has to go first to the borrower. And only if the borrower will not pay or cannot pay, only then, as a second choice, he goes to the guarantor. And in fact, that's the halakha that we follow, that the lender cannot go to the guarantor first. He has to go to the borrower first. And just like that's true for a live person who's a guarantor, that's the same is true for a person's property that acts as his guarantor, because that meaning that the lender first has to go to the borrower directly and say, hey, I want you to pay me back. And then he'll try to come up with the money in some way. Only if he refuses or cannot pay back or is not around, only then can the judge say, oh, he's not paying? Oh, if the borrower's not paying, now you can go to the guarantor, meaning now you can go and seize the land. So you see, that judge felt differently. That judge felt like maybe he followed the halakha that he agreed that a property is like a guarantor, but maybe he was following a different opinion that said that you can go to the guarantor even before you go to the borrower, and so too you can go take someone's land even before the borrower. But Rava says that's not the law of our Mishnah, and that's not our law, and so Rav Chanin did something wise. Now another similar story of a guarantor who went and paid the lender before letting the orphans know. In other words, you have a person who borrowed money. That person died. And now it goes to the orphans, right? The debt goes to the orphans. Now, you can't, if it's a oral loan, then he cannot get paid from the orphans. He has to wait till they grow up. If it's a written loan, if it's in a document, then he can. So we're talking here about an oral loan, and so the guy wants to get paid, and he goes to the guarantor, and the guarantor in fact pays. He doesn't even inform the orphans that he is paying. But now the guarantor goes to the orphans, and he wants to get repaid for paying the lender. Can he collect the money? Amara Papa, Piriat Baal Chob Misvah, V'yatmeh La Bene Mi'avad Misvah Ninhu. Papa says paying back a loan is a mitzvah, but orphans who are minors, they are not obligated in mitzvot, right? When they grow up, when they turn bar mitzvah, okay, then they'll be obligated, and then you come back then, and then they will pay you. So it's very nice of this guarantor to get paid, and because he didn't inform the orphans, maybe he assumed that he would get paid, and if he asked, then he would have been told, no, you're not going to get paid anyway until they get come of age, right? Anyway, the point is, okay, very nice of the guarantor to pay back the loan. That is what his job is, but he himself will not get paid until the orphans grow up. That's the opinion of Rav Papa. Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua Emar serare at peseh. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, agrees with the law, but for a different reason. He also thinks that the orphans do not have to pay the guarantor, but not because there's no mitzvah, but rather a different reason. We take into account the possibility that the father, before he died, may have paid some installments, some bundles of money to pay back, and we don't know about it. And so we need to wait till the orphans grow up, and then when they grow up, they'll go through all the father's books, his checkbook, his records, and then they will check to see if the father paid any installments of the loan. But right now, we don't know. Maybe he did, and therefore we cannot make the orphans pay the guarantor back when maybe part of the loan was already paid. So it's a completely different reason than Papa. My Benaihu. What would be a practical consequence? That would be a difference between Rav Papa's reason and Rav Huna's reason. Answer: Ika benayu keshechayav modeh inameh de shamtuhu umet beshamteh. A difference would be if the father, he's the person liable, before he died, if he said, "Oh, I did not pay any amount of it." So if we heard him say that, then for sure he didn't pay. Or if he was excommunicated by the court for not paying, and he died in excommunication, if he had paid some of the installments back, then they would have taken him out of excommunication. So the fact that he never got out of excommunication and died means that the loan was still outstanding. And so therefore, according to Rav Huna, in either of these cases where we can verify that the deceased did not pay any of the loan before he died, then the orphans can be forced forced to pay back the guarantor because they have to pay. But according to the papa, even if we know that the father did not pay anything at all, still the orphans do not have to pay because this is a mitzvah and they are not yet obligated in mitzvot. Shalchu mitam, shamtuhu umet b'shamteh, hilcheta k'Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua. A message came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, and they ruled according to Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, that if someone was excommunicated and he died in excommunication, that means that the father did not pay anything back, and therefore the orphans have to pay back the loan immediately, either to the lender, or if the guarantor paid, then they'll have to pay the guarantor. Me'tibeh challenged to that from a baraita. Arev shaya shetar chob yoseh mitachat yado eno goveh v'im katuv bo hitkabalti mimecha goveh. If a guarantor has a promissory note and he brings that to the orphans, he still cannot collect. What is he doing with the promissory note? It's as follows. If a guarantor pays the lender, so now what happens to the promissory note? The lender can't keep it because then the lender will be able to collect again. The lender was paid in full. So instead, the lender takes the promissory note and gives it to the guarantor. That way, the guarantor can bring it to court and say, listen, I paid up the loan as a guarantor for them, and therefore I want to get paid back. And so now he can go to the borrower, in this case it's the orphans, and says, I want to get paid back. He cannot collect just with the promissory note. However, the Baraita says, if it says in the document, hitkabalti mimecha, that means the lender, he wrote on the document, I have received from you the full payment, right? And I'm out of the picture, I'm good. If he writes that in the document, then the guarantor can receive payment from the orphans. So this is a challenge against Rav Papa, who says that you cannot collect payment. So that's what we ask. Bishlamad Rav Huna bered Rav Yoshua mashkach adla keshechayav modeh ela Rav Papa kashya. We could understand the sefa according to Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua. That's talking about a case where the borrower, before he died, says, I didn't pay any of the loan back. And that's why the orphans do have to pay back in that case, because the orphans do have to pay when we know that there were no installments paid by the borrower. However, according to Rav Papa, we have a challenge. Rav Papa says that orphans have no mitzvah to pay, and therefore they should not have to pay. So how come? Even though he wrote in the document, hitkabalti mimach, why does Rav Papa say he has to pay if orphans don't have to pay? And the answer is Shanei Hatam. Lachi tarach v'chatab la hitkabalti. No, that case is different, because that's the whole reason why we ask the lender to write in the document, I have received money, because if he writes that in the document, then it's actually considered a written loan. And as we said before, if there's a written loan that is claimed against orphans, the estate does have to pay, but an oral loan does not. And now we can explain both parts of the Baraita according to everybody. We're talking about a case where we don't know if the deceased before he died paid back installments of the loan. We don't know whether or not that's true, whether or not he did. And therefore, both according to Rav Huna and according to Rav Papa, if the lender did not sign anything on the document, then it's still considered an oral loan, even though he's holding the promissory note, but the promissory note is to the lender, not to the guarantor. So the obligation to the guarantor is still considered oral, and therefore he cannot collect. The guarantor cannot collect. However, once the lender writes in the document, I have received it, so now the promissory note is transferred to the guarantor, and it becomes like a written loan for the guarantor. And a written loan, everybody agrees that the guarantor can collect from the orphans. Okay, another story. You have a Jewish person who borrowed money from a non-Jew, and also a non-Jew was the guarantor. And that guy, the borrower, died, and now the guarantor, the non-Jewish guarantor, paid the non-Jewish lender. But now the non-Jewish guarantor wants to collect money from the orphans. Amar le Rav Mordechai le Rav Ashi, Hachi amar abimi mehagronya mishme de Rava. Afilu man damar chashinan lisrare hanem le Yisrael. Aval goy kevan de batar arba azil la chashinan lisrare. And so what do we do in this case? Rav Mordechai told Rav Ashi that he heard from Avimi, from Hagronya, in the name of Rava, that even according to the opinion that we suspect, that we take into account the possibility that the father paid some installments before he died, meaning Rav Huna himself would only say that in the case of a Jew, right? So if a Jew was the guarantor, then we worry that we suspect that maybe the father paid, and that's why, according to Rav Huna, the orphans do not have to pay until they grow up and check the records. And so if the guarantor was a Jew, then, according to Rav Huna, the orphans would not have to pay. However, even Rav Huna would agree, in this case, that's not so when the guarantor is a non-Jew. Why? Because if you're dealing with a non-Jew, you have to follow the non-Jewish law, the Dinah de Malchuta Dinah. And so they're going to follow the non-Jewish law. And since, as we mentioned before, under Persian law, the guarantor pays first. The lender has a right to go straight to the guarantor, no matter what. And therefore, since we know that the lender is going to go to the guarantor, it's generally easier to collect money from the guarantor, then we do not have to take into account the suspicion that the borrower is going to pay in installments. Why would the borrower bother paying in installments when he knows that the lender is not even going to come to him? Since the guarantor is a non-Jew, and the borrower and the lender is a non-Jew, and in non-Jewish law, the lender goes straight to the guarantor, so he knows, okay, he's going to go straight to the guarantor. I'm not going to pay. When the guarantor pays, and then the guarantor comes to me, then I'll pay. He's not trying to get out of payment. He just doesn't want to get into a situation of double payment, because he'll suspect that the lender, he's going to try to get payment from the borrower, and if the borrower pays some installments, and then he also goes to the guarantor, and the guarantor is going to pay, because under Persian law, guarantor pays. So when you're dealing with non-Jews, we expect that the Jew will not pay the lender directly any installments, but rather he'll wait to be paid they'll wait till the guarantor pays, and then he'll pay back the guarantor. And therefore, even Rav Huna agrees that in this case, the orphans do have to pay the guarantor, because we assume that we don't expect that there were any installments paid. That was the opinion of Rav Mordechai to Rav Ashi. However, Rav Ashi disagrees. Amar le adraba afilu leman de'amar lach hashinan lisrare hanem li Yisrael aval goyim kevan dedinayu batar arba azli I lav de'atpese srare meikara la hava mekabel le. Rav Ashi says to Mordechai, I actually think the opposite. Even according to the opinion that says we don't have to take into account partial payment. If we haven't heard that the father had paid anything before, we can assume that he did not pay anything before, and therefore the orphans would have to pay. And even according to that opinion only applies when you're dealing with Jews, because since you're dealing with Jews, a guarantor would be willing to give a guarantee even if the borrower did not put any money up front, no collateral or no partial installments, because under Jewish law, he knows the lender is going to have to go to the borrower first. And so the guarantor says, okay, I trust the borrower, that's the whole point, and I'm not going to be on the line, and therefore I'll be a guarantor because I know he's going to go to the borrower first. However, that does not apply to non-Jews, because under Persian law, the guarantor pays first. The lender goes to the guarantor first. And therefore, if not that the borrower had already given some collateral or some installment or partial payment, the guarantor would not have agreed to be a guarantor in the first place. And therefore, since that's the system of non-Jews, that the lender goes to the guarantor first, and the guarantor would not guarantee a loan if there was not a partial payment or collateral from the beginning. That's why we can assume that, since it's talking about non-Jews here, that this Jew is dealing with two non-Jews as the guarantor and as the lender, we can assume that there was, in fact, partial payment, and therefore, in this case, we cannot force the orphans to have to pay back this non-Jewish guarantor. He will have to wait until the orphans grow up. We now move on to the next part of the Mishnah. V'chen haya Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel omed ha'arev la'isha b'chtubata. Rashbag says that if someone becomes a guarantee for a woman's ketubah, he says, if the husband doesn't pay you, then I will pay, and I will encourage her to agree to the ketubah and go ahead and get married. If there is such a case and they end up getting divorced, the Bet Din will require that the husband make a vow that he can never receive any benefit from his wife ever again. That way, there'll be no chance that they'll get remarried. We are worried that they are getting divorced just so that they can collude and collect the ketubah payment from the guarantor, because he has to pay. Let's say the guy has no money, and then they'll get remarried, and now they have the benefit of all that money that they got from the guarantor. So we want to protect the guarantor from being swindled, and therefore the Bet Din makes the husband take a vow so he won't be able to get remarried. Moshe bar Asari, arba dechtubata dechalate hava. There was a man named Moshe bar Asari, and he became a guarantor for his daughter-in-law's ketubah. In other words, his son is getting married. His son is named Rav Huna. And the father, very nice of him, said, I will be a guarantor if you end up getting divorced or my son dies, then and there's no funds, I will pay the ketubah. Rav Huna bere surba medabanan hava udechika lemilta. So Rav Huna, that's the groom, he was a Torah sage, and he was very pressed for money and in a desperate state. Amar Abaye, leka de nezil de nasbe aisal Rav Huna, din garsha ledebitu, vetezil vetigbe ketubah me'abu, vehadar nehadera. So Abaye says, how come nobody is going to give Rav Huna some advice that he should divorce his wife and then go and collect the ketubah from his father, who is the guarantor, and then get remarried. And that way they will be able to have that money. So interestingly, the father is, for some reason, not helping out the son. Maybe he's helping him out a little, but whatever, the father is not willing to help out the son a lot, and the son is really in desperate straits, maybe whatever, not on good terms, or the father is, whatever reason, the father is not giving money to his son, even though he's in poverty. So Abaye says, why don't you just go give him this advice, get divorced, the father will have to pay because he's the guarantor, and get remarried. Amar le Rava, veha yedira nahana'atinan. Rava tells Abaye, you can't do that, because remember we learned in the Mishnah that if someone gets divorced and there's a guarantor, then he has to make a vow, a public vow that you can't undo, that he will not get benefit from her, and that way they can't get remarried. So this is not good advice. It won't work. Amar le Abaye, atu kol de migaresh beber dina migaresh. Abaye says, does everybody who get divorced get divorced in a bet din? You don't actually need a bet din. You need two witnesses. So Rav Huna, he's a Talmid Chacham. He can go find two friends, two witnesses that know how to make a divorce. And so he can get divorced outside of Bet Din, and then he can get divorced without making a vow, get the money, and then get remarried. In the end, I guess they did look into it further, and it turns out that this particular Rav Huna was a Kohen, so he would not be able to remarry his wife. So even if you went and found your own, did it outside of Bet Din and followed Abaye's loophole, nevertheless, it wouldn't work. And that's the folk saying that people say that poverty follows the poor, right? The poor only get poorer. In other words, the poor only get bad luck. This guy, not only Rav Huna, not only is he poor, but he even has the bad luck of being a Kohen. Well, it's good to be a Kohen, but not in this particular case, because he won't be able to go ahead and collect his ketubah and then get remarried. Now, did Abaye really say? Who should go tell him this loophole, this trick? How could Abaye do that? It seems unethical. And Abaye himself says, what does it mean, a wicked, cunning person? That's someone who gives advice to someone else to sell his property in accordance with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. We're talking about a different law that we've seen earlier in this Masechet and also in Ketubot, where Rashbag says, if someone on his deathbed says, I want my property to go to Mr. A, and I want him to use it his whole lifetime, and after A dies, I want it to go to B. Okay, so then that works, and A will use it his lifetime and go to B. Rashbag says, if A would sell it in his lifetime, then that's it, it's sold. And A can keep that money and it never goes to B because B is not triggered since it doesn't belong to A at the time that A dies. There's no way it can go to B. B can't go to those buyers and get it. That's what Ashbag said. Now Abaye said, you should not tell people this. If it happens and someone sells it, then that will be the law that it's a final sale and A can keep the money and just use up all the money. But if someone would go to A and tell them, hey, you can use this trick and keep it, that person would be called a wicked person, even though technically it's correct, but you're using your cunning in order to do something that was against the will of the original giver. So Abaye said in that case then that you should not use loopholes like this, and so he should apply the same principle here and say that the rabbis did not want people to get divorced and then get remarried just to get collect from a guarantor on the ketubah. So how could Abaye say, hey, someone go tell Rav Huna that you can use this loophole? And the answer is, Beno shaneh v'su b'Rabbanan shaneh. Answer is, a son is different. To use a loophole, to force a father to take care of his son, that's permitted. I mean, the father should be doing that anyway. Father, for some reason, was being stingy. So we can use a loophole in that case. And also a Torah scholar is different, that we're supporting this Torah scholar. And so that he can continue his studies. So for that also, it's permitted to use a loophole. Hold on. This, the father, Moshe, is only a guarantor, not a kablan. And we have a law that we're going to see in a second that says that an arev, a regular guarantor on a ketubah, does not actually obligate himself. We're going to see the reason why. Is because when he's doing so, let's say they're getting married, the guarantor is just saying it to her so that she'll agree to get married. But he doesn't really commit himself to paying because he thinks to himself, this is not a loan. It's not like she is giving him money and now she's going to be out. This is something that she gains if they get divorced. It is a legal right for her to get it. But if she doesn't get it, she's not negative. It's not that not like a lender who gave out $1,000 and now is lacking $1,000. So the guarantor says, this is not good. You should get it back. For this bride, eventually wife, she never gave $1,000. She just stands to get $1,000. So he figures to himself, I'm not going to really commit because it's not so bad if the husband doesn't pay. He should pay, but it's not so bad if he doesn't pay. And so a guarantor to a ketubah does not actually obligate himself. So how come the father would be even obligated? Even if this Rav Huna did get divorced, the father should not be obligated. And the answer is kablan hava. He actually agreed to be a kablan, an unconditional guarantor, who is obligated to pay in the case of a ketubah. Fine, that answer is good according to the opinions, a whole bunch of different opinions in this regard. That is good according to the opinion that says a kablan on a ketubah, even if the groom has no property, still the guarantor commits himself. We're going to see in a second that a guarantor is more likely to commit himself if the person that's borrowing or who he is committing for, or the groom, has property, right? If someone has a lot of property, right? This guy has $1 million and he asked me to be a guarantor. Well, he has $1 million, so I'm pretty sure he's going to pay. So in that case, I really do commit myself because it's simple. Whereas if someone has no money, and I say, yeah, I'll be the guarantor, I can't be that I mean it, because nobody would be a guarantor for someone who has no money and really commit himself to it. So according to and this guy Rav Huna had no money, right? We just said he was poor. So, and this even this answer that you just gave is good according to the opinion that says a kablan on a ketubah. Even if the groom has no money, still he does commit himself. Then it makes sense why Abaya said you can use this loophole and he will have to pay. But there's another opinion that even a kablan, when it's on a ketubah, if the groom has money, then he commits himself. But if he doesn't have money, then he does not commit himself, and did not have money, and therefore the father did not commit himself and would not have to pay. So how would he explain the story? Two answers. Either you could say Ravuna actually did have property when he got married, and then it all got destroyed later on, and that's how it became impoverished. So at the time of the marriage, because he had money, the father did in fact commit himself. Or you could say that a father for a son is different. A father would obligate himself even though the son is poor because it's his father. So either of those two answers. De'itmar. Now we're going to bring the basic law that we've been referring to. Arev de ketubah. Dibra kol la mishtabed. Kabelan de ba'al chob. Dibra kol mishtabed. There's two extreme cases that everybody agrees on. If someone becomes a guarantor for a ketubah, everybody agrees that he does not actually commit himself. An arev is a lower level commitment, and a ketubah is a case where people don't feel like a need to really commit themselves because she's not going to suffer any loss. She's not getting money, but she didn't pay out any money from her pocket when she got at the time that she got married. So everybody agrees there that the arev on a ketubah does not really commit himself. And the other extreme is a kablan who has a high commitment, a high level of responsibility, accepting upon himself, and it's also a loan where the lender took money out of his pocket, and so he really is expecting to be paid back, and the kablan is making an unconditional guarantee. So everybody agrees that that is a serious commitment he has to pay. But what about the in-between cases? Kablan de ketubah v'arev de ba'al cho pelige. If he is a kablan, high level of responsibility, but it's only a ketubah, or he's an arev, with lower level of responsibility, but it's a regular loan. That is a machloket. Mor sabar itle nichsel alove mishtabed, ilet lelan mishtabed, umar sabar ben itle ben lete mishtabed. So that's subject to a machloket, and one opinion says that if the borrower or the groom has money, then the guarantor will commit because he says, "Oh, he has money, so therefore I'm totally committed because it's not likely I'm going to have to pay." But if the borrower has no money, then he's just saying, "Yeah, I'll guarantee." But in his mind, he's saying, "No way, I'm going to guarantee that. I'm definitely going to have to pay." So he does not commit himself. That's one opinion. The other opinion says, "No, it doesn't matter whether the borrower or the groom has money or doesn't have money. If he says, I will be the guarantor on if it's a kablan on a ketubah or an arev on a ba'al chov, then he does commit himself. Now what's the final halacha in this case? Arev ben itle ben letle mishtabed bar me'arev de ketubah de'af al gav de itle leba'al la mishtabed ma'itama mitzvahu da'abad ve'lav midi chasra. And the final halacha is that if someone is an arev, a regular guarantor on a loan, then it doesn't matter whether the borrower has money or doesn't have money. He's put himself on the line. He is definitely committed and he has to pay. However, an arev on a ketubah, not so. The other extreme, even if the groom has money, the guarantor does not commit himself and is not responsible. Why? Because number one, he's doing a mitzvah. He's helping them get married, and she's like wishy-washy. I don't know. Is he really going to be able to pay my ketubah? I'll guarantee it. So fine, it makes her feel better. So he's doing it just so that they'll get married, which is a mitzvah. And she is not suffering a loss out of pocket. She never gave him money out of her pocket. It's just that at the end of the marriage, she has to pay her 200 zuz. So she is not getting a payment, but she didn't pay out, so she's not losing the money that she paid out, and therefore, since it's less of a loss, so the commitment level is also less. So someone who commits himself as just a regular arev in a ketubah is not responsible to pay. Baruch Adonai leolam, amen ve'amen.